Hello.
Hi,
Hi, George. Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you. Can you hear me?
I hear you very well. First of all, thanks for your time. It's good to see you. And I know you made a voyage these days in Southeast Asia.
Yes, I go there about twice a year and lecture on small cruises about Alfred Russel Wallace. We
Mhm.
sort of follow in the footsteps of Wallace. And yeah, it's great. So I've been to Indonesia numerous times now, across basically the whole of Indonesia. So that actually raises money for my Wallace Correspondence Project. So Sea Trek, the organization I work with, gives a generous donation for me, for my time to do this.
This is great. So,
Sounds good.
you made a lot of things regarding Alfred Russel Wallace. I'm a big fan of your work, and
Thank you.
I'm not joking because here I have this book with I know there's a first part written by you, and here in my personal studio, I don't know if I can show you. There is a poster right there. I don't know if you
Ah, yes.
from about Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin and their voyages, because I like to talk about voyages and great explorers. So let's come to the interview. You wrote a lot of material about Alfred Russel Wallace, including the introduction to his most famous book, this one. I have the Italian version, but anyway, the Malay Archipelago. And you're also the founder of the Wallace Correspondence Project and the founder of the Wallace Memorial Fund. Can you shortly describe the origin and mission of these projects? And first of all, how did you get interested in Alfred Russel Wallace?
Um, well, I'll try and condense the story. It started when I was doing my PhD at London's Natural History Museum on the evolution of mimicry in South American butterflies.
Mhm.
And I started to get interested in the theories that have been proposed to explain animal coloration and realized quite rapidly that most of them were actually proposed by Wallace. And I hadn't really, you know, heard much about Wallace. I was never taught about him during my zoology degree, or, it was always Darwin, Darwin, Darwin. And I realized that, he was co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection and started to read up more about him. And one of the things I read was a book by Marchant about Wallace's life. And at the end of the book, it says he was buried in a Broadstone near to where his house was, etc. And in 1998, I happened to be going down to that area on a camping trip, the first trip that my wife and I, my wife to be and I went on. And I convinced her to go to the graveyard and try and find Wallace's grave.
Mhm.
So not exactly very romantic for the first trip out together, but anyway, so we spent ages going around the graveyard looking for the grave and couldn't find it. And then we happened to walk behind some very big conifer trees, and there it was, sort of embedded in the branches of one of these huge trees. And it's a very unusual monument with a block of limestone as the base, and then a 7 foot tall, pretty phallic looking fossil tree sticking out the top. And you couldn't even see the nameplate that said Wallace was buried there because it was actually in the branch of the tree, and the whole thing was being tipped over by the tree roots. So I thought this is a bit shocking. One of the most important scientists in history, his grave is pretty neglected. And
Mhm.
so I did some research and found out that actually his two grandsons were still alive, and that they owned the lease of the grave, which I discovered only had 14 years left to run before they could remove the monument and bury someone else there. So anyway, I contacted his grandsons, particularly Richard Wallace, who sadly passed away now, And together we decided to set up the Wallace Memorial Fund to raise money to restore the grave and basically extend the lease by 100 years so the monument wouldn't be removed. And in the course of, that, I went to visit him several times and discovered he had this huge collection of Wallace documents. Wallace's, all the books that Wallace wrote with his personal annotations, lots of early letters, and even part of Wallace's private insect collection. And I asked him, has he ever considered donating or selling them to an institution? And he said, yes, years ago they approached Cambridge University Library and asked whether they would be interested in buying the letters, etc. And they said no, because they were focusing on Darwin, because that's where the Darwin Correspondence Project was. So anyway, I went back to the Natural History Museum, and to cut a long story short, I convinced the library to raise the money to buy all this material. And it went to the museum, was put in the rare books room, which is a restricted place where only the librarians can go. All the material was basically locked away, and although it was catalogued, you couldn't just go and browse it. You had to make a request. I want to see this letter from Bates to Wallace, and then the librarians would bring it down. You'd look at that and then have to request another letter. So I decided that it would be great to digitize all of the letters and put them online. And that then sort of escalated, and I decided, well, if I was going to do that, I might as well do all of the letters in existence. The second biggest collection is actually the British Library, but there's letters scattered across about 200 organizations, institutions, libraries, archives around the world. So anyway, that's how the Wallace Correspondence Project was born. And I got a grant and employed a archivist full-time. And together we tracked down all the letters, got scans of them, and then had an army of volunteers, over 100 volunteers actually transcribing them. So they're all transcribed now, and they're online in a database called Epsilon, which the Cambridge University Library maintains. And it contains all known letters to and from Wallace, and it's an amazing resource. No one in history has actually read all the letters. I've only read about 20% of them, and most other Wallace researchers have only read a small fraction of them. And I've already discovered some major new things in the letters. And as I say, I haven't even gone through them all because I've just been too busy organizing the project. But what really needs to happen now is that all the rough transcripts, which are full of spelling errors and other things, because the handwriting of these people is very difficult to read often. We need to spend a lot of time checking the transcripts, correcting them, and annotating them. So, which is what scholars expect. So, if it says, I went to see Mr. Smith today, you have to do research, find out who Mr. Smith was, put an end note saying Mr. Smith was the famous botanist, born, died, etc., etc. So that just helps readers actually understand what the letters are about. But it's all very, very time consuming and difficult work, and it will take, I've estimated it will take about 14 years for 2 people full time to do all that work. But at the very least, I'd like to publish all the early letters from his childhood, going up to about a year after he returned from the Malay archipelago. But we'll need about 2 years of money for 2 people to do that. And I'd like to get them published because I have a mistrust of having important documents in electronic form. I've had bad experiences in the past where a project has been left to IT people to manage after the work's been completed, and then it's basically been damaged. The database has been damaged because they don't understand, the nature of it. So anyway, it would be great to actually publish all the letters like the Darwin Correspondence Project has done. It's taken them 50 years. They've just finished their project at the end of last year. and they published about 30 volumes of Darwin's correspondence. And we estimate that Wallace's letters will take about 10 volumes of the same size, about 600 pages each. So yeah, there's a lot of work still to do. And along the way, I've been doing research on Wallace. I started off doing research into the exact circumstances surrounding the letter that he sent from Ternate Island in Indonesia to Darwin, and you know what actually happened, and discovered that the usual story about all of that is incorrect in virtually all biographies of Darwin and historical books. And it was a much more complicated story than people realize, and that Darwin researchers just dismiss the whole episode very quickly because they don't want to get into the fact that Wallace actually was the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection. They just basically say, well, Wallace sent this letter to Darwin, which contained a very similar theory, and that inspired Darwin to write his book Origin of Species, which basically became a wonderful bestseller and convinced the world about evolution by natural selection. And that's the last that's said about Wallace, but there's a lot more to it than that. In fact, I firmly believe that Wallace originated the modern theory of adaptive evolutionary change. So when people say, oh, Darwin's theory, that's actually incorrect. It's actually Wallace's theory, because Darwin's theory of adaptive evolutionary change included a component of Lamarckian evolution, which he believed in until his death, whereas Wallace rejected that false idea right from the beginning in his 1858 paper that was published jointly with Darwin. So the modern theory of adaptive evolutionary change is natural selection, pure and simple, no Lamarckism in it. And that's Wallace's theory, not Darwin's. So, but apart from that, I realized over the years how many other major ideas that are foundations of modern evolutionary biology are actually Wallace's ideas and not Darwin's or other people's ideas. They usually get misattributed. So even supposedly Darwin's theory of sexual selection is actually, most people these days believe in Wallace's version of sexual selection, which is all to do with natural selection and basically good genes argument, as we would say today, that females are choosing males because they choose the fittest males, and the bright coloration, etc., indicates fitness in various ways. Whereas Darwin believed that sexual selection was mediated by females just choosing the most beautiful males. But Wallace could never accept that, because he thought, well, how could a butterfly with a tiny little brain have a concept of beauty? He just couldn't believe it. So any theory of sexual selection has to encompass butterflies, beetles, birds, and everything else. Otherwise, it's not a very satisfactory theory. And Wallace basically came up with a much more plausible idea, which is now called Darwin's theory of sexual selection. So basically, myself and Jim Costa in America have been going through Wallace's writings, and because we're both evolutionary biologists and understand these sort of concepts, we're uncovering huge numbers of ideas that Wallace actually was the first to propose and are now famous ideas in evolutionary biology, but have been misattributed to other people. I mean, just for instance, the famous handicap principle of Zahavi, Wallace actually proposed that. Zahavi came up with it, about 30 or so years ago. He kind of rediscovered it, but people now believe that it's Zahavi's. And even the biological species concept that Ernst Mayr supposedly proposed was actually first proposed by Wallace in his very important paper on Malay papilionidae in about 1869. So the problem, I think, is that not so many biologists who are knowledgeable about evolutionary biology and theories that the subject is based on have ever delved into the history behind these ideas. And when they write papers about sexual selection or whatever, they just cite the latest papers on the subject. They don't go back to find out where these ideas have actually come from in the first place. So the whole subject, the history of the whole subject has become distorted and is basically incorrect, and it needs to be seriously revised. And I'm thankful that there are a few people who are now doing that, including especially Jim Costa. He's just brought out a new biography of Wallace called Radical by Nature, published by Princeton University Press. And it's the first biography that's really delved into Wallace's scientific ideas, because all the other biographies have just been about Wallace's life and Wallace, you know, events in Wallace's life, touching on natural selection, etc., but not actually going into anything else. And that's the problem with Darwin biographies. They all focus on, you know, sort of natural selection. They tend to exclude Wallace. And generations of biologists have, you know, read these biographies and have a complete misconception about the actual historical events, not only the historical events that led up to the joint publication with Darwin and the importance of that publication, but then all the subsequent work that Darwin and Wallace did, and how Wallace made such major contributions to evolutionary thought during his life, and was often more correct than Darwin. So, yeah, it's a sort of a bizarrely, you know, a field that is just really opening up now, and a lot more people hopefully will start seriously examining Wallace's writings. He's both unpublished and published. And there's enough material, interesting stuff in Wallace's letters to do several PhD theses. I know that it's there, like charting the development of his theory of reinforcement, which was his a speciation mechanism that he proposed. There's a ton of information about how he sent this idea to Darwin. Darwin didn't understand it, got his son to try and understand it, and Darwin never understood it. Wallace then sat on it for decades before publishing it, and it's a very, very important idea. Darwin never proposed a mechanism to explain how speciation worked, but this Wallace's idea was such a mechanism. But you know, a lot of work is needed just on that to understand, you know, the ideas and their history.
Wallace was a polyhedric figure. I discovered that he was interested in so many different topics outside the natural sciences, which surprised me, because he was interested in social sciences and politics, but also about spiritism, life on other planets. He wrote a lot of things in a lot of different topics. What do you think about this polyhedric aspect of his character?
Yeah, well, he wrote about 22 books on a very wide range of subjects, and over 1,000 articles, both popular and scientific. And as you say, he was interested in a very wide range of things, not only biology. He sort of focused on biology up until his 40s. After he came back from the Malay archipelago, he described a lot of species, wrote various books like Geographical Distribution of Animals and Island Life, and of course his famous travelogue, the Malay Archipelago. But then he started to get interested in spiritualism and started to write more and more about social issues. But he still kept up his work on you know, scientific work, and did so until his death, actually, in 1913. And he became actually the staunchest defender of natural selection after Darwin's death. It was only him and Weismann who were really still flying the flag for natural selection, because most other scientists by that time started to have doubts about natural selection. Although Wallace and Darwin had convinced them that evolution was actually a reality, they quibbled about the mechanism, and I think they wanted to make their mark and make their further their careers by thinking of other often totally absurd theories. So it was only sometime after Wallace's death in the 1930s that natural selection became accepted as the driving force of adaptive evolutionary change, and it was coupled with the modern genetics. And by that time, people had just forgotten about Wallace's work and attributed everything to Darwin. They saw Origin of Species and thought that that was the origin of everything, all these ideas, but in reality, it wasn't. But yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult to now correct the historical record because it's so entrenched. Everyone knows Darwin and Darwin's theory. So there we go. But getting back to your question, yes, he did a huge amount of work on all kinds of other things outside science, but that's not an area that I've ever been very interested in. I'm just really interested in his scientific contributions, and that's kept me busy enough and will for the rest of my life. I think there's just so much to discover, and I'm discovering new things, all the time, as is Jim Costa. In fact, I was just reading an excellent chapter that Jim Costa wrote for this book, A Wallace Companion, which was published in about 3 years ago, and I haven't had time to read this book. And just last night, I was reading his chapter on Wallace's evolutionary ideas and discovered that several ideas that I thought were that had been proposed by other evolutionary biologists were actually originated in Wallace's work. So yeah, he's doing a very good job independently of me in trying to understand what actually Wallace did and said and how these ideas have stood the test of time. But other people like Charles Smith, who's a famous Wallace expert, he's tended to focus on the more social and spiritualist side of things. But yeah, that sort of doesn't really interest me because I'm an evolutionary biologist. So.
Okay, so what do you think we can do to pay a proper tribute to Alfred Russel Wallace now, 200 years after his birth? What we could do to make him best known and known in the proper way?
Well, it's going to be difficult because, as I said, Darwin is so entrenched in people's minds as being the originator of everything. But the only way to do it is to start publishing well-researched scholarly papers and books, giving referenced information that documents Wallace's work and compares it with Darwin's, etc., so that scholars begin to take notice and realize that Wallace made massive contributions to evolutionary biology and science in general, and in some cases, in actually many cases, was more correct than Darwin, and that our modern theories that we still regard as current and we still accept them are actually Wallace's ideas, not Darwin's. But this is going to be a long, slow process, and I'm just hoping that when people start reading things like Jim Costa's books, etc., it will get them interested into doing their own research, and gradually it will become apparent to scholars. Because unfortunately, a lot of scholars most scholars that write biographies of Darwin, etc., are historians who have no background in science. They don't understand the scientific ideas and theories. because after all, they haven't had the training. So if they come across, something about, I know, males having, a handicap like the peacock's tail or whatever, they wouldn't know about Zahavi and his theories that are, the same. And they only really seem to be interested in, natural selection. The idea of natural selection, not exploring all these other ideas which together provided the foundation of the whole subject of evolutionary biology and evolutionary biogeography, etc. But until scholars have started to seriously re-examine these ideas and their history, things aren't going to change. I mean, it will eventually trickle down into the more popular books, but only when there's a big body of scholarly knowledge that says, well, actually, it was really Wallace's theory, not Darwin's, and you all got it wrong, and you better start sort of reading what the latest research has shown. So, yeah.
Okay. That's a good starting point. So thank you very much for being here, for your time, and I hope to get to London soon to get this book signed by you.
Oh, thank you. It might devalue the book if I signed it.
I don't think so. Thank you very much, and thanks for your time. When the video is out, I will let you know. This interview will stay in English with the Italian subtitles. And thank you again.
Well, thank you, and good luck with all the events in Italy. It's great to see that Italy is doing so much.
Hope we do our best. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.